Just real quickly, I'm Jamie Allen. I am the Director of Engineering for something called the Unified Commerce Platform at Starbucks. And that has absolutely nothing to do with this talk aside than me saying, we're hiring, and we're doing all kinds of really cool stuff with Scala and Akka and Kubernetes and Docker and Cassandra, and we're also looking toward the future and new architectures like gRPC, HTTP2, and using things like Linkerd so you have appropriate routing of your persistent connections now. So we're definitely taking a very forward-looking approach to technology. So if you're interested in talking to us about a job, we got a table out there. And if you want to find out what it's like to be a coder on my team, certainly talk with Poonam. She is one of our developers and also a leader of a team. So this talk is about open source and really how I feel it's in jeopardy. And it's in jeopardy from a couple of different dimensions. Before I start, I wanted to ask, how many people here are contributors to open source? Outstanding. I wanted to say thank you, right? Thank you for what you do. Because there are so many companies out there, I won't name them, Amazon, who will absolutely not contribute to open source, not pay for open source, but use it, right? And they are out there literally leeching off those of us who are trying to make the world a better place for software developers, right? I don't want to work for an organization like that, and I don't. At Starbucks, we have policies about sourcing vendors who are going to support the technologies that we implement. And that means that whenever we're going to use a certain technology, we want to have somebody there that we can call so we don't all have to be SMEs, subject matter experts on all these technologies. It's impossible, right? We can't know everything. I can try and hire a few people who know some things really well, but I mean, there are only so many Daniel Spiewaks. So, I know, right? But how many people get paid to write open source? Daniel Spiewak, and one other person. It's rare, right? And this is why companies like, I worked at Lightbend for 4.5 years prior to joining Starbucks, and it was a great job because somebody was paying me to do things in the open source world that otherwise I'd have to be doing on my weekends or at my nights, and not spending time with my family because I was so busy trying to help somebody with open source. So it's very few of us who have that opportunity to be paid to work on open source. But if you can, it's a great gig. Now, you'll find that sometimes people who work in open source get a little bit chippy, right? Because they make something amazing, like Travis Brown with the Circe library. I can never know how to pronounce it. Circe, which is a great way for serializing JSON and Scala. And Travis is an amazing developer. He spends so much time on Stack Overflow answering questions. He is the #1 Stack Overflow question answerer in Scala. And yet, he has limits, right? There's only so much he can do, and let's face it, if he's got to prioritize, it's the people who are going to pay him who are going to get the most attention. The question is, how do you pay Travis Brown, right? Do you open a PayPal account? If you're a corporation who wants Travis Brown's help, do you get a contract with them and go through the whole, I got to put in place the master services agreement, we got to design an SOW, we got to make sure there's a deliverable at the end. I just want him to answer a question for crying out loud, right? But he's going to do it on a priority basis. And I don't blame him. This is perfectly natural behavior. And I asked Travis for permission before posting this. He said, yeah, go for it. So one of the real big things here is that if you're going to be a large corporation adopting open source, there has to be somebody out there who can tell you how to use it, right? And when I was at Lightbend, that's what we sold, the idea that you could ask us any question about what was going on and get an answer from the experts. But, this sounds great, but not a lot of people are actually willing to do that. It's hard to sell free software. It sucks. You go in and you have advocates and people who believe in everything that you're doing and really want you to be successful as a company, but then you get into procurement and they beat you to death. They drag out every nickel and dime they can. I was talking to the 3rd largest hedge fund in the world, managing trillions in assets. That sounds high. Hundreds of billions in assets. Hundreds of billions, because trillions would be like the amount of money in circulation. Hundreds of billions in assets, and they have these massive contracts with Oracle and IBM and everything like that. Lightbend comes in and says, hey, you're using a paid driver for Slick. and now we want $20,000. And they say, no, we're not going to do that. We would rather write it ourselves than use your library and pay you 20 grand. Are you kidding me? They were like, we'll give you 12. I mean, you're paying $1 billion. I know of one company out there in the Netherlands who has an annual bill to IBM of $1 billion. Every year they pay IBM $1 billion. We walk in and ask for 20K? Nope. I mean, we start thinking that maybe we should ask for $1 billion and see how that goes, because maybe then they'll think there's value. I don't know. Now, it gets into the question here, does VC money, venture capitalists who are out there supporting these open source software companies that are providing the enterprise support, you see this with Databricks and DataStax, they've taken scads of money from various VCs, right? Because this is how you're going to scale your organization and be able to support more people. And that sounds great, right? But VCs have very opinionated beliefs about what people should be doing as an open source company, right? Without their money, we can't grow. We can't even start a company around these things. But at the same time, it comes with caveats all around the monetization of the company. Like, where's your valuation going to come at if you're services-based or if you're going to be product-based? So customers are always coming up to me and saying, I just want someone here who can tell me things are going to be okay, right? And here's the thing. At Starbucks, we're using Scala, we're using Akka, we're using Kubernetes, we're using Docker, we're using Cassandra, and I got to get contracts for every single one of those, right? I just want someone here to make sure everything's going to be okay. So, I hire a SME, or I get one as a contractor to make sure that I have somebody around to make sure I can deal with whatever's hitting me. But that isn't always the answer when there's bugs or issues with the production software. Investors, on the other hand, care about your valuation and all about product-based companies, because there's a 10x valuation whenever you're a product-based company, and it's more like 1 to 1.5 if you're services-based. So that's a big difference to a company out there. If your valuation was, if your revenues were something on the order of 100 million, let's say, which, not many open source companies have that much revenue. But if it were, 10x would be $1 billion company, as opposed to being worth 100 million or 150 million because you're services based. And they have ratios around this, like 70% of your revenue has to come from being a product company. And 30%, that's okay for services. We recognize you have to do some of it, right? But if you fall below that 70%, you make your investors very unhappy because they're watching their multiples go down. They don't like that. So open source companies sit there and say, all right, well, we got to be a product-based company. We need a product. What are we going to do? Well, let's come up with something as a service. Maybe we'll create a notebook in the cloud that is absolutely nowhere near my actual data. And I will try and figure out how to start doing live analytics on it, right? Which sounds like a useful product, right? You have a notebook with all these capabilities that allow you to derive real meaning from your data. But again, it's nowhere near your actual data, so you got to export petabytes of data over to it, right? Some other companies, I won't name names, are out there trying to create their own platform as a service using their own technologies. Nobody's asking for this. Not one person is out there saying, boy, I wish I had X as a service. No. And to be honest with you, I've got Scott and Matt, who you just saw talk about building a DevSecOps platform over AWS. They're pros, right? They know security. They've been auditors. They know what they're doing. I'm not entirely sure that the open source companies who are trying to build X as a service have any idea what they're actually stepping into, nor do they understand the security concerns. Could Starbucks ever run on X as a service from somebody on the outside? Plausibly, but we're going to go through a lot of compliance checking, right? A lot. And it will be difficult for those people because you may say Starbucks just sells coffee. How many people use a store value card at Starbucks? Right? That's where you download money from your credit card onto your store valued card. And that represents a pretty significant float of money that we happen to have, that we have to account for, track, keep safe. You'll see other offerings around enhanced functionality. This is more the DataStax approach around DataStax Enterprise, right? Monitoring, that's always a super popular one because wouldn't it be great if somebody would just show you how well this thing was running? And then you end up with like 90 different windows to watch just a single application run. And you've got to figure out how you're going to consolidate that. And ordinarily, you'll see people start interacting through StatsD or something like that, so you can get all that data into a single place. We're using Splunk. Production tooling, that's always useful. You've got support contracts, which allow us to sell you the idea that we're always there to help. Commercial licenses, that's things that most developers don't care about. They're super important to companies who are going to be licensing that software from you. Indemnity and warranties come with that. And then minimal services, right? All right, we will give you consulting for a couple of days at a time, but we will not send somebody in there to work with you forever. And then freaking Hortonworks comes out with this baloney idea of an advanced support engineer. Has anybody ever heard of this? It's brilliant. If we go in and send you somebody at a huge amount of dollars per day, they can be there and not services. They're technically still part of production support, right? Because there's no SOW and no deliverable. The second they check in code or something, they've broken the contract of an ASE. So basically you bought somebody useless. Dead serious. And you know what? I've seen the companies get scammed by this because they say, well, I just want to know that I have somebody around who's going to make sure that everything's okay. But you've got somebody who is effectively neutered. They can't help you the way you want them to. All they can do is stand behind your developers and tell them what to do. And they're bored. I've seen those poor people. They're not enjoying what they're doing. Yeah, we've had experience working with some of these people, and they don't enjoy it. They want to be consulting and building stuff with you, not this. So what do you do? Now you also have all these different, open source companies. Imagine if you're using Kafka and Cassandra and Scala or heck, just Java. You've got Oracle asking for your money, Confluent asking for your money, DataStax asking for your money. Every one of these companies is a separate procurement process, all right? Mesosphere actually did something really interesting where they tried to consolidate this down into what they called their infinity stack. Have you seen this? Where you get support for a lot of these technologies out of the box. That sounds great, and then you only have one procurement process to go through, and Mesosphere divvies out the money to everybody at the end. But it hasn't really worked so well because inevitably everybody says, I deserve a bigger chunk of that. Or more importantly, wait a second, Mesosphere, you just gave a 70% discount? What? We never agreed to that, right? So it's always tricky. And none of these companies are best friends, right? They all know each other, they all talk to one another, they all get along, but at the same time, they're all out there to try and make money independently. So this is very much a situation where you see people saying, and this is Jay Krebs, who's the CEO of Confluent, right? The creators of Kafka. Jay has spoken here at ETE before. Competition among open source projects and really, their companies behind them definitely feels like, I want it to be us who get this dime every time, not that other company, even if it's not something in competition with you. It gets a little ugly sometimes. Because here's an example. Working with a really large, consumer electronics company in Cupertino. I won't name names. They sat there and they built this really cool system in Akka. And what it did was, if you had some sort of device, it would, if you had a thing on that device crash, it could send a report back to that company, right? And you could say allow or don't allow, right? If you said allow, it takes a dump and it sends it back to the company. And they get billions of these a day. And then we're wondering, if we put that into Kafka and then we run it through a series of, Akka, components to do some transformations and then put it in Cassandra, can you do that? And I'd say, yeah, that's really not that hard. We built the system with them, and it was great because you didn't have to worry about anything being coordinated. There was no monotonicity or ordering to the data. Anything could come in any order, and there was it was fully associative. You didn't care that something else happened and this happened, and then you did something. It was all independently handled so it could scale. It's great. We had a contract with them. They bought. We were like, yeah, got it. And then after a year, they didn't renew. And we said, why? They said, well, it's in maintenance mode, and it's done, and it works great. It's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so you don't need anything from us? No, but we have to pay that other company over there because there's a huge bug in Kafka. So you're literally being incented not to write software that is good. right? Because then you can't sell a contract. I'm convinced this is why MongoDB still exists. I didn't say that. Oh, rats. Make sure you blot out my shirt. All right. So the impact. FOSS enterprise support companies, cannot focus on their communities. And you see this. There's pain here. We see this in the Scala community a tremendous amount. People want Lightbend to help them and provide certain things that need to be done for the language to progress. Lightbend can't. They are a steward for enterprise support. As much as they love the community, and believe me, they do, every single person they hired was a part of it, right? And yet, they can't support the community as much as they want. They just, as a business, can't survive if they do. And then they come up with these feature roadmaps, and not just Lightbend, every company, that have nothing to do with what customers are actually asking for. They've just got to come up with something. It's always got to be a great idea that the VCs think is going to be monetizable. And it inevitably isn't, right? It's just some product that you thought was a good idea. And you see these flameouts all over the place, right? We're going to do X, and we build this thing, and nobody buys it. Not a single person used it. And now you see people struggling because their projects are getting canceled, but they were really useful things. It's just maybe they were kept proprietary and not open sourced when they should have been, because no ecosystem ever grew around it, right? And now the community feels left out. All that money was being spent on projects that were for things for customers, and the community wasn't getting any focus or attention, which sucks, right? You don't want to be that person talking to the community and having them angry with you because your company isn't doing the things that everybody knows need to be done. The only way for these companies to survive, if you ask me, is to sell services, period. The ideas for product will come from the services you deliver instead of trying to invent the wheel before anybody even knows what a car is, right, or a bicycle. So if FOSS companies, and it was funny, I gave this talk at Scala I/O, and Martin Odersky was sitting right there, and he's just like this. Because, Martin advocated for this from the very beginning. But because of the VC investment, and let's face it, TypeSafe was created by VCs, right? That was a company that was not, like two people saying, hey, let's get together and make a company. No, the VCs looked around and said, let's put these things together, right? But initially, they tried to get, Lyft and Akka and Scala together. That didn't work out for various personality reasons. And then Jonas made the decision to go with Martin rather than going with the other creator. And that's where, Jonas and Martin became the heads of TypeSafe, and they hired Mark Brewer after, you remember Donald. That was, a good year and a half that Donald ran the company. But they had to get away from services. And that wasn't fair, because if you ask me, services were really what the value proposition of the company was in its early days. Instead, they created monitoring. It melted. It literally melted. It couldn't handle all the data coming out of all these Akka actors. You spin up 1 million Akka actors or something like that on a single box and try and track every time something is enqueued into a mailbox, dequeued from the mailbox, and finished processing, boom. I guarantee you've just melted your disk. You've got a big data problem now. And that's not what it was set up to be. So Splunk was really the answer that we didn't know we needed back then. Anyway, one of the interesting things about this is you see these global systems integrators like, Accenture, Capgemini. All of them want to look like they're cool kids. How many people have seen a person from one of those firms present at a conference? One, maybe two. All right. On open source technologies. One person, open source technologies, presentation by one of these firms. They are not incented as a group to do anything to help the organizations behind these technologies. I remember being here in 2007 at Philly ETE. Rod Johnson was speaking, and he gave an extremely inappropriate speech with inappropriate slides talking about how angry he was at these SIs. Anybody remember that? Was anybody here in 2007 and when we had it at Drexel? Yeah, well, it was ugly, but it was true. They don't care, and they never will, but they have to look like they're cool so they can charge you $300 an hour for somebody who barely even knows what Akka is. I literally sat with somebody who told me that they were going to write their wedding website with Akka. And I said, that doesn't even make sense. And they were pitching him to me as a tech lead. And I said, no. We're going to put all of you morons into this corner over here, right, until we can get you out. It was unfortunate, but real, right? Because what do they care? They figure if they can't send somebody to 2 weeks of training in St. Charles, what's the big deal, right? That's all it should take for anybody to know any technology well enough to go consult on it and make $300, $390 an hour. Yeah, no. Anybody who's done any kind of asynchronous programming knows it takes a long time to internalize the dynamics of those kinds of systems. So really, I found that boutique services firms, I worked at Chariot. I took great pride at working at Chariot because it was a company that really felt that they did the right thing for the customer. Same thing at other consulting firms I worked at. I can't live with myself knowing I'm just taking money from someone or being worked into the ground because somebody sold something that was totally inappropriate. Boutique services firms tend to have a much better approach to this. They've got their own SMEs. That's how they differentiate themselves. And, they themselves contribute to FOSS, which I love. So Dean Wampler had a conjecture, and I thought this was pretty funny, What if we can't change this? What happens to this whole world? Will mature OSS only come because Nike decides to start putting stuff out? Don't get me wrong, it's great that they do. And inside of Starbucks, I'm busy now advocating for us to open source some of the stuff that we're doing. It's going to be a little bit difficult because Starbucks is a company that is conservative by nature around this thing. They know what they want to do, but sometimes it's hard for them to say, how are we going to get there, right? What are the legal steps we have to go through, all of that. And how are we going to make sure that we're doing it in a way that's good for the Starbucks brand? Really, who wins if it's only the big companies who are doing this? IBM is actually playing a huge role in Spark these days, and also Flink. They're starting to see how the world's changed around streaming data and the processing of this, and taking the open source projects around them and helping push them forward. But if IBM's not there, what happens? If it isn't the IBM name behind Spark, is Databricks enough to carry that? And that's not a slam on Databricks at all, right? It's just CIOs tend to be conservative by nature. And when IBM is saying that this is the bomb, they're like, yeah, all right, IBM said it, I feel clear. Now, interestingly, Scala is a little different because it has multiple levels of support that I don't know of any other, open source project that has this. It has the Swiss government funding the Scala Center. They are literally providing the money that enables the Scala Center. The EPFL is a school where all the academic research in the language takes place. And people say, well, Scala's got everything in it. Yeah, it does. You want to know why? Because a whole bunch of people are doing research in it. That's why. And some things pan out and some things don't. And we learn from that. Yeah, that does mean there are 20 different ways to handle an error. But you know what? Each one of them probably has a nuance. And I actually do sit there and tell people, you really do have to understand, A, your problem, and B, how each of those solutions might solve it to know what the right one is. And nobody wants that. They just want to know if error not equal to nil. That's what they want. And it drives me crazy because that's not even going to guarantee that you get the error that last happened if anybody's ever coded any Go. Anybody? Anybody Go program? Okay. It's fun. You have Lightbend providing the enterprise support, right? You've got the community out there providing all kinds of not only contributions to Scala, but to the libraries around it, like the Typelevel ecosystem. And then, interestingly, corporate sponsorships, where you see huge companies like SAP, IBM, Verizon, all taking part of the Scala Center. They're all investing in the Scala Center and have board seats, right? Those are huge companies saying, we want to be behind this and influence the future of Scala. But you know what? They can never control it. And that's a good thing. Because winter is coming. There are multiple organizations, and I just named two of them, IBM and SAP, primarily in my mind, that are really going to want to have a significant say in what the future of Scala is. Now, they can't buy Scala. Scala is owned by the EPFL, right? Lightbend owns the production compiler that most people use. Typelevel also has a compiler for Scala that they've been working on. But most people probably rely on the Lightbend compiler, which means that if they want to control Scala, they can control how it compiles by buying Lightbend. There is the community choice for how we can get around that if that were to happen, right? But it's It's something to keep your eyes on because SAP in particular is doing something that I can't talk about, but is incredibly powerful with Scala. Like they are, if you think about what SAP has historically done in building ERP systems and how you might change them whenever they go into production in a particular environment, and how there was a proprietary nature to that before, what would happen if that weren't true anymore? So SAP has a very vested interest in making sure that Scala continues to grow in a direction it favors. We need a way to make sure we support FOSS, right? But what about other projects and languages? What about Clojure? How do we make sure Clojure survives as a meaningful project and doesn't die on the vine? Go, right? Go has support from Google. I have a matrix here that I put together, just compared languages to some degree, and I didn't include every single one of them. And it wasn't intended to make Scala look at all those check marks just for Scala and everybody else is screwed. No, because this is a confluence of events that is almost, in a way, luck. Timing, the people who got involved, you name it, right? But we need to make sure that other languages, like remember Groovy lost its support when Pivotal pulled, right? And the people who were involved in that project suddenly now didn't have a home. And hopefully, one or two, I don't think Guillaume did. I think Guillaume ended up going to Google, becoming a Google advocate. But he's still trying desperately to try and make sure that Groovy has a place at the languages table. We've seen what's happened with Java, where there's stewardship from Oracle, and we end up with things like Jigsaw going so well. Doug Lee, a couple years ago here at ETE, predicted that Jigsaw would never happen. And I'm not entirely convinced he's wrong. At this point, where Java 9 is supposed to be tracking and Jigsaw is going to be in it, is it really going to be Jigsaw by the time it comes out? Yeah, Daniel.
Quickly, you should probably add a corporate checkbox since Comcast actually does pay it full time maintainer employees.
Yeah, okay, so I need to make a distinction about the vocabulary here. Enterprise support is what you're talking about there. Well, okay, no, I do see what you're saying. You're saying that they're paying somebody to develop Clojure, the language.
Primary maintainer of Clojure works for that.
Yeah, but being the company that is also providing the support, I think I want to make the distinction between like when Verizon or IBM does it versus when the company that makes the compiler or whatever is also the one who pays people to work on the language. It's an important distinction because Lightbend technically does not do that. Lightbend pays compiler engineers who happen to occasionally contribute something to the language. They are not rewriting the language. That is the role of the EPFL. I know, it's a tricky distinction there. But it also shows something. If we don't have all these levels of support, how successful can a language be? Not just successful in terms of monetary success, but successful in the community. I would argue that is Go successful in the community? Not because there aren't a tremendous ecosystem of tools built with it that are surrounding the language, but more whether or not the community can influence the direction of Go. I see occasional discussions on the mailing list and stuff like that. And there's a lot of, no, Rob Pike said we'd never do that, right? And that's okay. Rich Hickey does that as well for Clojure. In Scala, nobody says that. But that was funny. No. Anyway, but with Go, does the community have the voice it needs to have the language be successful to the community, right? Does Java? I would argue definitely not. Because even whenever we had the Java community process, we all knew that Oracle and IBM were the ones who were the ultimate arbiters of what was going to go in there. And it was, what?
Harmony.
Harmony, yeah. Yeah, we won't talk about Harmony. Anybody remember Project Harmony? Wow. Literally died. They swept it under the rug.
Wow.
I know. That wasn't that long ago. Was it 8 years? Oh. All right, so what about the ecosystem? Key projects must be sponsored. And here's my thing. I've got Bill Venners working on my team, right? And that's fantastic. I get to work with Bill Venners in the Scala test group at Starbucks, and they're helping us build out our CI and CD tests, right? The whole pipeline of tests that we're using to make sure that we're deploying services that are going to work. And I often argue that Bill's code is the most important code we're writing right now, because as we iterate through building out these platforms that we have now, we need to make sure that we don't break the countries that we've already rolled out to, right? So Bill's work is extremely important. I can pay him to consult. Now, how do I pay him to make sure that Scala test always exists? That's not guaranteed. I mean, yeah, Scala test is pretty well adopted and stuff like that, but things come along. I look at Scala check, and there's a new, I just posted about this on Twitter. I'm sorry, Hedgehog. Thank you. Who was that? Oh, thank you. Hedgehog, this new project Hedgehog for testing that works with Haskell, Scala, and F#. There's another functional language, I forget which. Yeah, maybe. But anyway, Hedgehog is another project where you see people making significant advances in property-based testing and repeatable, automated, and yet variable testing, right? Where I want to make sure that it's not just the things I threw at it that I know will work, but things I never thought of, right? So I need to make sure that Scala test is going to be around so that I don't lose support for this technology. How do I do that? Are coalitions like, yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
Maybe I'm grabbing a point here, but I think, but like, what do you think about things like Verizon hiring Ross Baker to?
I'm going to get to that. I am going to get to that. Thank you. Did I actually get to it yet? No. All right. But yes, because there's a really good example about this sort of thing. What happens when the primary committer to a project gets hired by a company? Look at Apple with Norman Maurer and, Nettie. Now Norman has to work on Apple concerns all day long. And then when he gets home, well, he works from home, but when he stops working for Apple, he then has to work on the community stuff. And it has to come at the expense of his nights and weekends. And Apple does not care. That's not why Apple hired him. And that's not why he's able to go to Thailand every year and enjoy a couple weeks on the beach like he just did. Good for him, right? He's getting paid. But at the same time, not good for the rest of us who are using Nettie, because we don't get the support we need because Norman's off doing other stuff. That's not what we want. But I got to that before the slide actually brings that up. But yeah, are coalitions the key? Is it going to be that I can pay a Typelevel foundation or something like that to make sure that my concerns are always going to be supported? So that then you have like Scala test start to align itself with a group of other projects. Maybe they, like Monix just became part of Typelevel, right? Before I would have had to pay Monix directly and Typelevel. Now I only pay one. But what if I wanted to use something else that isn't in the Typelevel ecosystem, but I still want to support that, right? How do I get that alignment? And really, it almost makes you feel like you got to have a PayPal or something to be able to send money to people. But that doesn't work in corporations. Procurement is not going to allow you to just use a credit card and, well, okay, you can get away with that sometimes, but only at very limited amounts, right? Not whenever I want to send 50 grand a year to bill vendors to make sure that Scala test continues to be supported, right? So we need a way to do this. And it was really interesting because it was actually Miles Sabin who told me about this site that is called Bountysourcecom. And this is a way to do sort of like a PayPal thing and provide people like Sam Halliday here, who's the guy who writes Ensign primarily, is the main contributor to it now. These are people who can now contribute to open source projects through something. I have still not gotten the buy-in I hope for from Starbucks around this, and that's going to hopefully come in time. Right now, we're not in production with the stuff we're building yet, so it hasn't been the primary focus of the org. But in time, what I would like to see, what I'd like to see is the ability for me to pay the various projects I want on a basis like this in a recurring way so that I know that the projects I need to have supported in the future are always funded. Yes, Daniel?
How is this different from Patreon?
From what?
Patreon.
I have no idea. But how is this different from
Patreon, yeah.
Patriot?
Patreon.
Patreon. I have no idea. I don't know Patreon.
It's basically like artists use it a lot because they'll have like these sporadic deliverables, right? Like people want to support artists, but they don't want to like pay them to avoid while the artist is consistent, right? So like the idea is that you sign up to pay a certain amount.
Yeah.
Like whatever you want.
The idea is to pay a certain amount for a deliverable. Is that correct?
When the artist just like delivers it. And the artist decides when they deliver.
I see what you're saying. An artist, whenever an artist is going to make a painting or a sculpture for you or something, that's a physical deliverable.
They just like hit the button that says, yes, I did something, and then you have a pay.
Right. I think the model's slightly different in that I don't care whether Bill actually delivers something, and I don't want to have a contract that's deliverable based. I just want to have a recurring contract to give him money.
There are some software developers game models, but it looks that way.
Okay.
they get access to update them on like 1 week early or a couple of days early.
Right, through like Minecraft or something like that. Well, who arbitrates the actual transaction?
And basically some people have shifted to basically full time developing content, and most of these mobs actually open source into licensing. So they full time develop open source and they get paid by the community because there's enough people willing to chip in $5 a month.
But again, that's like on an honor system or something like that. True? I mean, I want this to be a little bit more focused around corporate mentality of repeatable licensing of, but not even licensing, support of software, right?
Go further than that, though. You want to be able to say, man, I'm looking at this money up here, and I'm seeing, a goal of $1,500.
Yeah, like Kickstarter or something like that.
And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, I can't live on $1,500 a month.
I know.
Right? And what you want is you want the bill vendors of the world to have, in a sense, almost monetary independence, right?
That's a really good way of putting it. Monetary independence for the committers to,
Otherwise, you get into the netty situation.
yeah,
Where the guy, he's got to eat, so he's got to work for somebody else, and then whatever spare time he can carve out of the company and his family, because you don't want them to live just for you,
yeah.
he'll maybe have some time to contribute to this. If you want this to work, it can't be $9.20 a month.
You're absolutely right. And Sam still has to work, right? Sam Halliday is actually, employed to work at various banks and stuff inside the UK. It's exactly true. We want the monetary independence for the people who are creating and contributing to these projects. But also I don't want to have to pay Bill to consult in order to make sure that he stays afloat, right?
Right, you want to do it in a way that's not going to get the IRS climbing up your butt.
Yes, I don't want the IRS climbing up my butt. That would be no fun.
And I think the distinction here that you're making is that these are individuals paying that $920 a month. Right. So for
I want Starbucks to do it. Yeah.
puts money in. Starbucks could very easily say, okay, I've got 20 projects and $20,000 a month may not be a very large amount of money.
Yeah.
So you could very easily put $1,000 in. And with individuals, we may say, I'm willing to put $10 a month towards something.
Yeah. But would we? Has anybody done that?
Yeah,
I haven't. I actually haven't. I'm a bad citizen.
I have, but I'm under no illusion it solves any problem.
I know. Because you've been there. Yeah. So vendor management, large corporations have to have approved vendors, right? And that's what actually the biggest hurdle I have is that in order to get through procurement, these have to be vendors with whom you have agreements in place and all that kind of stuff, which we don't, right? For open source, like how am I going to get money to Typelevel if I don't have an agreement in place to make sure that I, can do that? And does Typelevel even have those agreements and that kind of legal sponsorship to make sure that they're able to even provide that to me? That's difficult. So we got to find a way past this. And you know what? The global SIs actually have a really big role that they can play here. This is a way they could give back to these communities because guess what they have in place with all these large companies? Vendor agreements. Wouldn't it be great if you had Scala test? I mean, all right, great relative term. Scala test by Accenture. I mean, it sounds laughable, but Accenture has the ability because they've got the connections and the vendor management in place to be able to provide this service to open source. But we may still need a bridge, and I haven't figured out what that is yet. So Scala's success is not just because of money, right? It's really because the community has supported it so much over time. And enterprises now need to step up. They've got to find a way to do so in a meaningful way. And so let's figure out how to do that. Like I said, I haven't done that yet. I've got to get some way through to make sure that Scala test continues to exist even after Bill Venners is done at Starbucks. So that's it. Any questions? Or do you want to go drink? Yeah.
So follow-up.
Oh, hold on. Yeah.
Microphone. Thank you. So a follow-on to my earlier with a couple of examples from the Scala community, right? Ross Baker from the HTTP4S project, Michael Pilquist from FS2, and also Paul Chusano from FS2, and a couple of other sort of similar situations. All of them have sort of been hired by big entities, Verizon and Comcast in those cases.
I would argue that Pilquist was hired before he.
Well, this is true,
contributed
yes.
to open source.
Pilquist's solution is sort of, his situation is sort of backwards from this, but Ross Baker and Paul Chusano very clearly. So a stipulation of their hiring is that they're not only, so they're actually spending a significant amount of their work time on like strictly community things. So like Ross Baker, for example, quite recently ported all of HTTP4S to FS2 and CATS, which is something that Verizon does not use at all internally. It was a really important concern of the community. And like Ross did that on Verizon time. So like, I think there are some people that have been able to find, some project maintainers that have been able to find this balance.
Yeah.
But I don't know how to like encourage companies like Verizon, like Starbucks, like Comcast to continue pushing that forward. And ideally also smaller companies that are not like mega firms that, you know, have sympathetic individuals inside of them.
This, 1 second. This is a really unique situation because I do come across this in various places, and I can't name names of companies or anything like that. But I will say that I have worked with open source vendors who have had people on their team who wrote code on, you know, a corporate time that a corporation was paid for, and then included it in the open source distribution, which technically breaks almost every legal consideration of the master services agreement. It's a security problem, it's an intellectual property problem. It's very rare that companies and their legal departments can make that leap to where you've just said, right? That has to be a corporate, like, strategic goal at high levels of the company where, you know, chief legal officers preside, that they want to do stuff like that. So that's, I
forgot about the copyright.
yeah, and you know, then there's you know, the whole thing around. Mike Pilquist obviously has a tremendous amount of pull in the organization where he works, right? He's a very well-respected engineer within his organization. Not all organizations are as flat as Mike's, right? And that means that you have layers of bureaucracy you have to go through in order to get that kind of approval. And most people are going to be scared of the impact, right? In most organizations, I think. I would love for that to be true. I would love for my developers to be able to contribute to open source while they're working on stuff because it's helping our stuff too. I can't allow it yet, right? It's hard. Yeah.
I just want to comment on that real quick. That's one of the things that Comcast has been trying to do and is trying to do better. At the moment, a lot of the time when we do that, we just write code for ourselves, and then when we have it work for us, we just push a pull request out to the community, and we don't do anything more than that. And that's not enough. It doesn't get merged upstream. It doesn't, because there's no discussion in the mailing list. There's nothing like that. So, and often the code is very specific to our situation. It needs to be generalized. We are trying to do that better, to basically have the additional time to make the pull request, get it merged upstream, give it enough support that it get merged.
Yeah.
Because ultimately it helps everybody. Because a lot of this is just like interoperability between two commonly used libraries and stuff like that, that lots of people use. I know that some of the code other people have used, even though it's not officially merged upstream, just because the pull request is out there. You can take the code.
You can still see it, yeah.
It's just nobody does anything with it. No, officially, not merged in. It's not. And that's the missing link. That we need to find time to merge it in.
I don't know. I mean, and there could be any reason why it isn't merged in. I don't know. It's
right. I mean, the internal reason that we have to justify to business is if it gets merged upstream, it's no longer just a purely internal support issue, it's supported by the whole community. So things like interoperability between logging frameworks, because you have libraries that use 2 different months, and hey, lots of people want that.
Lots of people want it. Good luck getting it out to them.
getting it.
And here's the other thing. If you did that inside of, say, a large organization, even if you went to another company, you still couldn't write that again and put it out there. Not legally, right?
It is out there.
No, but I mean, technically you can't do that. If you wrote that code, say, and Comcast had a restricted policy around this, maybe they don't.
Comcast specifically allowed, so the check gets allowed to be pushed out.
Right, but I'm just saying that in other organizations, that's not necessarily true. And then another person has to tell somebody else how to write that code because they can't write it again. And that's actually a problem I've had in the past, where I'm not allowed to implement something specifically because I've done it once before and it's intellectual property of a company.
When I was at Comcast, when I was a consultant to Comcast, I had to go home, use my personal computer, make the pull request, then push it up on my own time, and then it would come down, and I could then pull that thing in. And I only had to do that once or twice, but it was just that was the workaround to not have to go through lawyers and stuff like that.
Oh no, and I remember when Comcast open sourced a library here at ETE, 3 years ago? What was it called, Galactic or something like that? Anybody remember that? Yeah. John, what's his name? Yeah.
Now I'm on the complete opposite side of that. I work at Automatic, and we have teams of developers that work on WordPress core, that work on WooCommerce core, and our CEO basically said, anything you want to open source, you just go for it. Just do it. You don't have to ask. There's no lawyers. There's nothing. Just open source.
Lightbend was like that. You could work on any project you wanted to. Nobody cared. Most of corporate America isn't like that, unfortunately. Okay.
All right, so I have an observation that's going to sound a lot more profound than it probably is. But
I expect no profundity from you.
There you go. So, but that'll be in keeping with the talk, right? So, you started it.
I know.
It occurs to me that a lot of what we're trying to solve used to be the norm in the software industry when companies had R&D budgets. Right? I mean, you think back to the days of Unix. Now, granted, you had to be Berkeley or you had to have a special license.
Xerox.
But eventually it made its way out, right? And it was all done as pure R&D under the rubric of these large companies who saw a value in pure R&D as paying off down the road. And that's partly, I think, what's missing here, is that everybody is, and the VCs contribute to this, as you pointed out, but the large companies and the needs of their shareholders contribute to a lot of that. It's all about what happens on the quarterly basis.
Yeah.
Until we can at least get a little bit past that mindset.
Yeah, you're right.
It's going to be difficult to get this kind of crowdsourced R&D back up and running again.
What most of the startups I've seen in the open source world say is R&D is really just product development. Right. Product development based on something no customer ever asked for or wanted. Would you buy this if we gave you monitoring? Yeah. You build the monitoring, nobody buys it. Frickin' fantastic.
So I'm probably going to retire in about 5 years, and that's when I think I'm going to be doing my open source, if I cannot convince my current president to open source the product I'm working on right now. But I mean, that's something all of us who've been in this industry for a while, that's something we may want to think about. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope to retire someday. I will say that working for a language-based startup was probably not my best path toward doing it. Yeah.
So on the subject of companies built around open source, building a monetization path, especially companies that are VC funded. Obviously, that's something that's somewhat personally interesting, since I work for a company that is VC funded that is built around open source.
No less. Yeah.
But a product company, yeah. So that I kind of fall into that interesting bucket that you were like, well, this actually doesn't work. I guess I'd be curious as to like what your honest thoughts are on sort of what Slam Data is doing, because they're monetizing based on a product. Sort of a premium offering, right? But it's sort of a premium offering that we actually like, people seem to need, basically. So like if you're not familiar, right? Basically, Slam Data's open source offering doesn't have any permissioning. So like, okay, you can use it, but like everybody can see your data. Have fun. And if you actually don't want everybody to see your data, like presumably you actually want the premium offering, which has permissioning. So like does that fall into a category of product that you think is actually a sustainable monetization path, or do you think that there are actually dragons there?
I would think it's better for me to make the distinction that I'm probably talking more about infrastructure projects or language projects, right? For a pure product company that's building a product around a business need with a business plan, right? That's different, right?
Throw Databricks in there as an example.
I'm not sure Databricks is any different than the infrastructure I was talking about.
Well, is it though? I mean, the model's still the same. They employ most of the major contributors to the particular open source product because it is in their business interest to do that.
They do, yeah.
Right?
They hoard them.
But having realized that there's no way really to monetize open source
Yeah.
that allows VC funding, they too have a premium offering that's built around that same thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the killer, right? And you see this where so many of these companies have had what we call a down round, where they took money at a certain valuation, and then the next round they took was at a worse valuation. And believe me, if you are an employee who has been through a down round, it's really difficult to feel like your work has been valued, right? I don't want to name names about the companies, but pretty much every single one of the infrastructure companies you can think of in the open source space has suffered through this, right? And it's brutal. So, and you know, you almost see this, you see this on Silicon Valley, right? Where the guy's talking about how, you know, I don't want to take too much money up front. Because if I do later on, then I'm going to end up, you know, with a down round later on, and I'm just screwed, right? All those shares you took, all the dilution you get hit with later. I mean, literally, it's really hard to get rich in one of these companies, right? Now, back to the Slam Data question. I made that distinction that as a company that had a business plan based on a product from the start, as opposed to I've got an open source project and now I need to monetize it, I would say it's a different world, right? But I would say don't ignore the services component. Sell the shit out of that, right? Because that's where the money is, right? You have the SMEs, you've got the people who are going to help people derive value from your product. And don't fall into the trap that you have to stay above the 70% of your revenue because the money's out there, go get it. Really, why turn away money, right? The VCs will find a way to deal with that, I'm sure. Your revenue went up, that it was better than having a 10x valuation on 10 times less money. I don't know.
Sorry, I keep coming back. So Automatic, we have a little bit of all those things. We have WordPress VIP, which does very large websites like TechCrunch.
Yeah, right.
So that's our services, right? We also have WordPress.com, which is a SaaS offering. And then we have WooCommerce, which uses a premium model. So WooCommerce is free. And then if you want additional functionality, you can buy extensions for that. Right. So I think we're weird in that we've been able to do all of those things. But I think that those are good examples of how that could work. But again, it doesn't always seem to work out like that.
Yeah, it's really hard to define that premium model around like a language.
Yeah, that's
what am I going to do?
You don't
different... get this collections library functionality unless you pay me. You know, actually, it sounds like really smart.
Yeah. Whereas WordPress is a lot easier since it's like, you know.
Yeah. Daniel again. You just want to hold the microphone and take it around to other people?
So, yeah, sorry to keep asking questions.
No,
I don't mean to monopolize the conversation. So I have an unrelated question to the ones that I was asking previously, which is that what do you think about the potential of addressing this with a new open source license? So the thought process starts here, right? So, I mean, GPL kind of came into existence because there wasn't really a way to do this in a way which was, to do, free open source in a way which was conducive to copyright assignment, and also conducive to sort of perpetuating that open source, right?
Right.
And a lot of other licenses have sort of addressed this or more or less ignored it. But all the licenses thus far have been either of the GPL band, which is like thou shalt be free open source, like et cetera,
and therefore never allowed to be used in a company.
Therefore, not very corporate friendly, which is a reality. or Apache-like, which is like, okay, we're going to solve all of these problems around, the IP, but it's essentially unrestricted beyond that.
Yeah.
What about do we actually need to go to a more call it a livable license or something like that, which is like, okay, this is open source, like people can contribute to this, but if you're a company above like X revenue as a percentage of world GDP, I don't know, like you have to pay into some organization which represents the sum of the contributors.
Yeah.
Like, is something like that possible? Like, does that even make
yes
sense?
and no, because remember what I told you. What about the hedge fund I told you about? They're paying billions to Oracle, and yet 20 grand was too much for them from us.
Right, but what if they're forced to do it?
Yeah, but then
that's
they'll
part
just
of the
say, screw
license.
it, we won't do it.
Well, they won't use
They literally can be that petty. It's ridiculous.
Well, or forced is the key word there.
Yeah, but then they will. I bet you that they would restrict usage of that library. They would. Huh? Who's going to force them to use it? They would say.
Well, force also implies lawyers.
Lawyers, yeah, and they got more
Right?
of them. He's
And-
right.
Right. They got more of them. They can afford to say to you, screw your 20 grand, we're
Yeah.
using it anyway, because you're not going to fight them in court.
In fairness, no company will say that. No company will tell you that we are going to break the covenant of this license because we are bigger than you. All of them want to be compliant. Nobody wants to be non-compliant.
I mean, once licenses do become big enough, there are organizations which stand up for this. Like FSF goes into court for GPLv2, right? And,
Yeah.
and obviously there's TiVo is a great example of a company that got slapped on the wrist for that.
Yeah.
So imagine if you're an Amazon, right? And you're using a lot of this software that has this livable license hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
Like, at some point you're going to pay because your entire business model is based on FOSS, and like you have to.
No,
But
they won't. That goes all the way to Bezos.
yeah,
Dead serious. They have an antipathy toward paying for open source. Yeah. It's not pretty. And the people who come from Amazon also
stop
sometimes
depressing me,
share that
Jamie.
view.
Just stop depressing me.
I know, believe me. This is a reality I've dealt with for 5 years now, right? It's just, it kind of tears me apart. All right, well, thank you very much.